What is the oldest language? By oldest, I mean out of the thousands of languages spoken around the world today, which one has been spoken for the longest time? This is a minefield of a topic, and most linguists I talk to do not want to touch this subject with a 10-foot pole, foremost because it's a massive waste of time. But fret not, I am no linguist, and I have no shame rising to the top of the banned linguistic subreddit, which I have a feeling is going to happen anyway. So, since there are way too many complications to answer in this problem, and because languages have been around for a way too long of a time, even beyond the dawn of civilizations, it's never going to be an easy answer. Unless you have a time machine, it will all come down to your criteria and personal opinion. It's safe to say that languages change all the time. If you think about it, the language you spoke 10 years ago is probably not the language you speak today. This question assumes a certain continuity to a language. So, looking for the natural language that is spoken in its exact form for the longest time would be a pointless exercise. Furthermore, if you accept the out of Africa theory that all humans moved out of East African savanna, you could argue that all existing languages could be traced back to these ancestral forms. But that's not what we are after, as we are interested in the modern forms of these languages. So this is actually one of the bigger complications of answering this question. We assume that if you trace back a language long enough, you could draw a line and say that at this point this language is not intelligible, and at this point it becomes the modern version of that language that now we understand. But it is not that simple. Let's take English as an example for convenience sake. Before the current versions of modern English, we have what is called Middle English, which roughly follows the late Middle Ages until the invention of the printing press in the late 15th century. Modern English starts its formation since this time with a lot of changes in pronunciation and grammar. To most of us, Middle English is unintelligible without any training. Listen to this clip of MIT Professor Arthur Barr reading a short excerpt of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in Middle English.
The Assat was saced at Troy, the Borg Britned and Brent to Brondus and Ascus. The tulk that the Tromus of Trazen there wrought was treated for his treachery, the truest on earth. It was Ennius the Arthel and is he a kindred.
Now, as you know, English becomes much more intelligible to us when Shakespeare comes around 200 years later from that read.
From forth the fatal lines of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. And it's that, it's the lines,
And as I mentioned before, the Gutenberg printer has a lot to do with that. So although where these lines are about intelligibility are quite subjective, by and large, we can categorize languages to certain periods and subperiods according to their changes and significant transitions. So this is why you also see Old English or Late Medieval English as periods or subperiods of English. And if you had hope that English was in the running for the oldest surviving language, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Let's look at Latin for a contrast. Originating in the area known as Latium around central Italy, which is where Rome and Roman Empire would grow to be, Latin had a lot of influence on the growth and the spread of the Western civilization. This is one of the reasons why it is known as a classical language. But you probably also heard that Latin is a dead language. Now, what makes Latin dead and English alive is its active native speakers and its usage in day-to-day life. Latin, as far as we know, is not used in a day-to-day context by the average citizens of Italy. But the Vatican City could be thought as an exception, but not because Latin is the lingua franca of the state. Due to practicality, Italian is actually used as the official language of the Vatican City since 2014. The prominence of Latin in the Holy See is because Latin is also a sacred language, also known as a liturgical language. A sacred language is a language used in religious contexts, explaining the prime reason why Latin survived through the ages despite falling out of favor as a communal language. The same could be said about the ancient language of Pali, which originated in India, which perhaps has been around for longer, at least since the time of Gautama Siddhartha, also known as Buddha, who lived around 26th century BCE but has been kept alive by Buddhist monks preserving the teachings of Buddha up to this day. What should be noted here is that a dead language is different to an extinct language. And it is an important distinction. It is a language that nobody effectively speaks anymore. Like this Native American Siouan language, Mandan, that went extinct with its last native speaker, Dr. Edwin Benson's demise in 2016. Or the Badeshi, a language only spoken by these three men in the foothills of a remote mountain valley in the Gilgit-Baltistan region in Pakistan. As you would have guessed, Badeshi will become a dead language after these three speakers, as in each example there won't be any active speakers or written usage of that language, making it extinct as opposed to a dead language. So many think that this is also the case with the language of Sanskrit. There are many parallels that could be drawn between Sanskrit and Latin. First of all, Sanskrit is also one of the most important liturgical languages, mainly to Hinduism. It was also the language of the upper class and had great influence over most of the current South Asian languages and even as far as Southeast Asian languages. Arguably, Sanskrit kicked off the whole study of linguistic history, and it holds a very important place in the study of Indo-European studies, as the body of Sanskrit literature is one of the richest due to its usage in many Vedic and philosophical texts as well as poetry and drama in the ancient Indian literature. So, the ancient Vedic Sanskrit could be placed between the 18th and the 12th century BC. The most important aspect of Sanskrit is its methods of memorization, exceptional complexity, rigor, and the fidelity of grammar laid out by the ancient philologist and scholar Panini somewhere between the 6th and the 2nd century BC. Panini's work still forms the basis for many modern linguistic theories, and his work on morphology is compared to the work of Turing's machine in the 20th century due to its complexity and detail. So, if we go by the earlier Panini's treatise, which is a significant turning point for classical Sanskrit, we can put Sanskrit around 6th century BC on the spectrum. Now, of course, the so-called common period of Sanskrit, albeit being slightly different, does not change much due to the rigorous work by Panini, which is only a little help answering our question. But this is where things get a bit interesting or complicated. If Sanskrit is a dead language, why am I wasting your time with it, right? The problem is, Sanskrit is sort of making a comeback. In the 2011 National Census of Nepal, 1,669 people reported that they use Sanskrit as their first language. Sanskrit has been declared as one of the official languages in the state of Uttarakhand in India, and it has been seeing a resurgence in speakers due to religious and nationalistic movements. And the Indian National Census reported 14,135 speakers of Sanskrit in the country, and the numbers are steadily growing, which arguably puts Sanskrit in the running for this title. And that is of course if you disregard the hiatus in the middle. That brings us to another important sacred and classical language with a similar story, which is Hebrew. Hebrew completed a full revival as Sanskrit is currently undergoing today. It is well and alive today within the Jewish communities and in the state of Israel. Hebrew fell out of favor and became a dead language after the medieval period and kept alive by rabbis and by academic pursuants. However, Hebrew was revived as the Zionist movement picked up steam in the 19th century and finally went on to become the official state language of Israel in 1948. However, if you only studied biblical Hebrew, you would remain almost unintelligible to an Israeli today, just as it was in the case with English and Old English due to many natural changes that happened over time to the lexicon of Jewish people living in different parts of the world and have picked up a lot of borrowed words from the languages. And many of these words have been evolved from its ancestral version that is based on biblical Hebrew. Although it should be noted that there are some who argue that essentially these two are the same language. Even if we agree with these arguments, biblical Hebrew doesn't come into play around, well, the Bible. But the oldest available scripts of Hebrew dates to the 10th century BC. But the few linguists I spoke to and many on Quora seem to agree that these two versions of the language have drifted too far to be intelligible without any training. Also, biblical Hebrew texts don't have the same luxury of an intense grammatical treatise that Sanskrit enjoyed, which in this case, rules being steadily established over time. Okay, now that we're across that minefield, let's move on. The other main contenders in the running that we usually encounter are Chinese, Persian, Coptic, Greek, and Tamil. Out of these, Coptic language or the ancient Egyptian language is much older than any of the other languages and is being used in the same way as Latin is being used as a religious language, but only by a handful of people. Coptic could be traced back as far as 3,000 to 5,000 years in recorded history, but it is no longer used as a native or first language. And obviously, it has transformed into a completely different language. The survival of the language through the ages, however, is very remarkable. Modern Chinese dialect, Iranian, and Greek, although are very old and continuous, are significantly different from their ancestral forms to their modern versions. For example, Mycenaean Greek, which is the oldest of the three languages, dates back to around 17th century BCE, and actually the oldest written text of any surviving language belongs to Greek, dating back to the 15th century BCE, written using a writing system known as Linear B, predating the modern Greek alphabet. So obviously for some linguists and some of you viewers, therefore choosing Greek as the oldest language might make the most sense, as some people would argue that using the oldest known written text as the criteria would make more sense than pursuing something as intangible as intelligibility. Going by that rule, no other language even comes close to Greek, with Pali Prakrit text appearing in Buddhist Asoka pillars in 3rd century BC, Dravidian literature, and the Dead Sea Scrolls roughly around the same time. This brings us to the last language in this list, which is Tamil. The case with Tamil is also unsurprisingly a bit murky, but no less interesting. Tamil is a Dravidian language of the Indian subcontinent. Unlike Sanskrit, which was developed by the migrating Indo-Europeans, Dravidians were indigenous people of the subcontinent. If you looked up this question online on forums, there's a heated debate among people about Tamil being the oldest continuous language. Since you already have a much better grasp on the context and criteria of other languages we spoke about, let's look at Tamil from those same lenses. Tamil is a living language. There is no doubt about that. It is one of the official languages of Singapore, Sri Lanka, and some southern states of India, respectively. Also, there are more than 70 million native speakers around the world with many dialects. The ancient Tamil literature known as Sangam literature can be traced back to the 3rd century BCE. But this is where things start to become debatable. First of all, Dravidian languages being indigenous to the subcontinent are definitely older than that. Although all the other languages we discuss are probably older than what we mentioned, Tamil throws in one more complication. One of the cradles of human civilization, the Indus Valley Civilization, is often argued to be a Dravidian society. Indus Valley Civilization can be traced back to at least 3300 BCE. Now, this is where all the arguments center around. Tamil being a Dravidian language, perhaps could be continuously traced back to this time, if in fact the Indus Valley Civilization was definitely Dravidian, to which there is some strong evidence, but the problems we explored with Middle English and Modern English does not exclude the Tamil language. In fact, many other southern Indian languages such as Malayalam also evolved from the same Proto-Dravidian language. And sure enough, the Sangam literature will not be mutually intelligible to the average Tamil speaker today. The language has also gone through a lot of Sanskritization, borrowing vocabulary, grammar, and literary style from Sanskrit, although resisting it more than other languages in the subcontinent. So I wish if there was a straightforward answer to this question, but the simple fact is that there isn't. And I should warn my viewers and accept the fact that most of the information I've given here are debated by academics. So this video might not stand up to scrutiny in the future, and I'm pretty sure that there are errors and facts I missed. Please note them down with any other information you want to add on the comment section and let me and others know. I'll see you next time.